In 1994, I wrote an article in a newsletter that I published at the time that the headline was Indexing, the Second Best Choice. And basically what I said in the article was indexing as an investment strategy was very good, but it could be improved upon provided that the individual involved had the ability to select mutual funds that could outperform, that had a decent chance of outperforming the stock market. And secondarily, if they weren't going to outperform, they weren't going to crash and burn. They would not be terribly far off the mark. And so implicit in my writing that article was a claim that I could do that. And I was doing something the other day with a couple of funds and a couple of client accounts that reminded me of the article and what I purported to be able to do. And I said, let's take a look. So that's what this video is. I'm going to show you three versions of this picture. This first one is just the Vanguard 500 index fund from 1999 to the present. The reason I'm using 1999 instead of the 1994 date when I wrote the article that I referred to is that there's some limitations in the graphing, and I can't really give you a good, easy to follow presentation if I use the 1994 starting date. However, everything I'm about to show you, it would be the same, just harder to illustrate if I use 1994. If anybody wants to contact me, I can step through that with you and you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's remind ourselves what indexing is all about. Essentially, the idea is that with indexing, instead of having a whole staff of very highly paid people trying to pick stocks and outperform, you say, I'm going to do this mechanically. I'm going to take a list that's published by somebody. The Standard & Poor's 500 index is published by the Standard & Poor's 500 company, and it's not intended to be a great stock list in terms of investing. It's just supposed to be representative of the U.S. economy, really. And we're going to take that list, and then we're just going to invest in those stocks. And so it's mechanical. You don't need nearly as many people, and it can be done very inexpensively. The cost for this fund is the expense ratio is about, let's say, 1/7 or 1/8 that of the typical fund. So it's a lot less expensive to run it. And the index people will say, all those portfolio managers and so on really aren't worth it. They introduce all this cost and they don't produce a superior result. And the evidence is really quite good that is actually true. On average, most of the time, most actively managed mutual funds, those are the ones with the portfolio managers and all the staff and everything, fail to outperform. All right, so that's actually pretty compelling. The other point that the indexers would make is they say, it's true. If you index, then you can't do any better than the index. You give up all opportunity of outperforming. And yes, there are going to be some funds that are going to beat the index, but you can't pick them in advance. The indexers would say it's just not possible to pick them in advance. So, why try? If you try to do it, you're just going to hurt yourself because a number of the funds that you pick are going to end up doing worse than the index and you're going to end up worse off. That's really the heart of the argument. And that's really the key point that I want to talk about today. All right, let's look at another version of this. All right, so the blue line is the same as it was, the Vanguard 500 index fund. Now I have an orange line on here. What's that line? And that is a very famous, at one time extremely widely held mutual fund. It's the Fidelity Magellan Fund, and I chose it for a very specific reason. In recent years, it has sort of faded away a bit, but back here in the very beginning, 1999, it was the biggest stock mutual fund, I should say, around. And if you had gone into a Fidelity Investor Center back then and said, I'd like some help putting together a portfolio of your mutual funds, what can you do for me? You almost surely would have walked out of that place with a big chunk of your money in the Fidelity Magellan Fund. And by the way, at the time, you had to pay a surcharge to even get in. There was a 2% surcharge. So, Fidelity we think of as no load, but there was actually, you could call it a 2% load at that time. And the reason they could do that was because of the demand. So this is what would have happened if you had put your money into the Fidelity Magellan Fund at that time and you just held on to it until today. You would have ended up here. And clearly, the index approach would have been superior by really quite a margin. And the look of this is, exactly why the index people say, don't bother trying to pick that great fund. You're just going to underperform if you do that. Just index, and you'll end up ahead of the game. I don't think you can do better than this chart to demonstrate that whole phenomenon. You've got this super popular fund, and it actually ends up costing you money, so to speak. All right, let's look at another picture. Okay, so this picture with all the nice colored lines represents all the stock mutual funds I've used since 1994, except for one. There's one missing because I've only got 7 slots available to me on this graph, and I used 8 funds, so I had to drop one out. And the one I dropped out is almost a twin of this green fund here. It's a select version of the same fund run by the same manager, and it did almost identically. It did a little bit better, actually. But the reason I dropped that one out was because I had less client money in that than I had in this green one, so I thought this would be more representative. So these are all the funds that I've used, all stock funds, in client accounts that I manage directly. I'm not talking about 401ks, that sort of thing, where I only have, whatever choices the plan sponsor decides to put in there. This is where I can choose from among thousands of funds, the ones that I like, and these are the ones that I used. And I didn't use every single fund with every single client account, in equal quantities the whole time, but it was relatively stable. Any given client account that was a mutual fund type of account, which by the way is a minority of my accounts. Okay, this is not most of what I do. This is a kind of a relatively minor part of what I do, but I always have some mutual fund accounts. So this is what I did with those. Most such accounts might have had, say, 2 or 3 of these stock funds in them, not all 7 or 8 of them, all at once, all the time. And I did make changes, but just not that much. It was relatively stable. And so what you see here is, before I make that point, I'll say one other thing. Every single one of these funds, at one time or another, underperformed the S&P 500 for periods of time. Maybe even for a few years in a row. But overall, every single one of them outperformed. Every single one, all 8. And according to the index people, that's not supposed to happen. All right. So, maybe I got lucky. I don't know. One other point to make about this specific portrayal here is that, in a way, I actually did a little better than you sort of might gauge from just looking at this, in that I had really quite a bit more money typically in these, the highest performing, these 2 in particular, there's the pink one and the kind of bluish one here, especially since somewhere around here before the financial crisis. That's where I've had really the majority of client money that I do have in mutual funds. All right. Early before that, it was other funds. This maroon fund was a one I used very heavily for a while. And this orange fund here was another one that I used very heavily for a while. But, starting maybe in here somewhere, I kind of got a little bit out of those and more in favor of these other ones. Okay. Now, again, I want to reiterate, I do think indexing is a good strategy for many people. And I don't think most people can pick funds, including most professional advisors. They just, if they pick funds, it's going to be like the Fidelity Magellan Fund that I just showed you a minute ago, and you're going to do worse. I do have one really big problem with indexing. And right now, I kind of worry because indexing has become very popular. All the gigantic funds now are index funds, all of them. And there's very much a vibe that, this is a no-brainer, and then if you do anything else, you must be a fool, and you're being ripped off. All different versions of that. That's what you read in the press. Active management is for the birds, so on and so forth. The problem is that many people, I'm sure, I can't quantify this, but I just know how this works. You've got all kinds of people who have put their money in an index fund, and lately it's been great. The thing has been going up, 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 And it seems like, well, yeah, this is surefire. It's just so easy, and I'm a smart guy and all that sort of thing. But if you sign up for indexing, you're signing up for this. All right, this is the financial crisis. This peak to trough decline was over 50%, and I pretty much can guarantee that there are a bunch of people out there who are indexing that don't really quite appreciate that this is their exposure. All right. One time or another, we're probably going to have a decline like this. Could be worse, by the way. It doesn't have to be, no worse than this. It could be actually worse than this. And there are going to be some people who are going to be surprised because they were doing the smart thing and they weren't really prepared for what happens sometimes. Now, there are measures you can take to mitigate this. My clients in here, I wasn't 100% invested going into the crisis, so they got somewhat of a buffer from that, and you could do that here too. But then you have to make decisions about, lightening up, and that adds a lot of complexity. So not everybody's going to be able to do that. All right, I'll talk to you soon.